BBOR, Black Box, online radio, coming to you from West Virginia. I mentioned a couple months ago on the channel that somebody had posted a meme on Facebook that asked the question, if you could have a 15-minute conversation with any serial killer, living or dead, who would it be? And I thought about it when I saw that, and I decided Charles Ng, one of the Boneyard Killers, and I have some very specific reasons for that. But I noticed that the top comment on that post was someone who said, the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski. And another thing that we mentioned last year on the channel was, if we're going to talk about true crime, yes, we talk about some lesser-known cases. Yes, we want to talk about learning new things. But we should also put out some uploads about some of the more well-known individuals in true crime history. And like last year when we did Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, H.H. Holmes. And that's why I think it's a very good opportunity to talk about the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski. He's somebody that a lot of people probably have familiarity with because there are an enormous amount of materials surrounding Richard Kuklinski, even here on the internet. What I did was I went through the Iceman saga, just completed it. That's a 5-part podcast series that is put out by the Serial Killer Podcast. That's hosted by an individual named Thomas Viborg Thune. I listened to a lot of his stuff, but I was like, I can't just only listen to what one podcast host has to say about Richard Kuklinski. So I was also going through some other things online, but most notably, the Iceman tapes. And it's lengthy, I'll tell you that much. I really recognized that it was going to be a very long effort. I would listen to about 30 minutes one day, then start to think about it a little bit, 30 minutes the next day, and so on. What do we make of this guy, Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman? He's perhaps one of the more well-known serial killers out there, but the thing is, from the beginning, being mentioned on the Serial Killer Podcast, we were just like, is this guy even a serial killer? Because you might even be wondering, should he fall into that list? Because the majority of the crimes that were committed by Richard Kuklinski were not because of what we would typically think about the actions of a serial killer. He was a paid-for-hire hitman. These were hits. These were not someone who was dealing with their own internal issues. But I'd say the biggest kind of counter-argument to that, saying, yes, indeed, Richard Kuklinski was a serial killer, was he did commit additional murders that were not paid hits, that were not killing for hire. And actually, he committed his first murder at the age of 14. So what you can say about Richard Kuklinski is he's a very complicated individual. He had an insanely horrible childhood. And, when you hear the stories about growing up, not only being beaten by his mother, but being beaten with a broom handle, sometimes so harshly that the broom handle would break over his body. I was like, oh my gosh, poor kid. That's the moment when you just feel something for this person. I know he would have grown up to do some very, very disgusting and horrible things, but still at that moment, you feel something for the person and you're just like, wow, I mean, that just sounds absolutely terrible. Just to go through things like that on a regular basis. That's one thing that would have pushed Richard Kuklinski down this pathway. Another thing is, he encountered a lot of social conflict in his teen years, and even being pushed to the edge to the point where he committed his first murder at the age of 14, as we said. But then, I thought there was something very interesting about that. Just hearing the stories of how he was just overcome with emotion and things like guilt, and it feels like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, where it's like all of this, darkness and feeling overtakes him. Not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of similar. And I just began to think about that in terms of, what would we say about the psychology of somebody like the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski? And the first thing I think that indicates is he was not sociopathic. Because when I was watching the Iceman tapes, I first heard Richard Kuklinski talking. And I think this might sound a little bit cliche, but I was like, wow, he sounds so cold. A little bit cliche, but that's true. But you can see over the course of the interviews that he would do, he would really warm up to the interviewer. More emotion would come out. Definitely not sociopathic, where he doesn't have a conscience. Though I think that he experienced a lot of childhood abuses that would have affected his mental state. Absolutely. It's what we call shattering of the pillars of childhood. Someone such as his mother, who was supposed to be protecting him, ended up abusing him. The community around him was not making him feel safe. These are the shatterings of the pillars of childhood. It happens very frequently, and it happens almost all the time when it comes to a serial killer. And when we talk about the pillars of childhood here on this channel, it is not specific to the parents or family members. It's pretty much any time there is a major betrayal from someone who is supposed to be protecting this child. So that's the first thing that I would know. The second thing I noticed is when Richard Kuklinski would talk about his family, very specifically his wife and children, he showed remorse. I didn't really see an enormous amount of remorse for what he was saying about killing people, but how this affected his family, how him being arrested and him being in prison affected his wife and children. So, first and foremost, he is experiencing some human emotion there, but it's definitely not what a lot of people would have expected and what a lot of other people would have anticipated as functioning in somewhat of a different way. Now, Richard Kuklinski was somebody who operated in a variety of different ways. He operated with different methods. And when we talk about serial killers on this channel, very frequently we're like, okay, this was the method, this is how he killed people. Or in cases of female serial killers like Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham, it's like they had their method, targeting patients in a nursing home. With Richard Kuklinski, it's all across the board. He killed people with guns. He killed people with poisons like cyanide. He killed people by strangulation. One time, he even fed a person to the rats, and so the person could be eaten alive by rats. And Thomas Viborg Thune really brought something up when he was saying the reason why that he chose to put Kuklinski on the Serial Killer podcast, even though the majority of murders that he committed were paid hits, is because he was so sadistic about it. He was someone who really took some pleasure in the killing, and that's the argument that they're putting forward. I would have some mixed things to say about it, because a lot of it's relying on some secondhand sources, but yes, it does appear that way. It does appear that way. I mean, we're not mind reading anything, but it really did appear from a lot of the other source material that Kuklinski enjoyed killing people. You know, even the point one time shooting a person in the face with a crossbow and feeling good that the crossbow was now a new method that he had to kill people. When I first heard the name Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, I began to think that they were calling him the Iceman, because it's like putting the body on ice, or maybe you think about the morgue, or just that when a body is dead, it's cold. But he actually got the name the Iceman because after murdering somebody once, he hid the body in an industrial freezer. And, there's this whole network of criminal activity going on in New Jersey. Supposedly there still is to this day. It really hasn't changed that much. It's that what you see is just that they were even trying a method once about freezing bodies, and then once the body had thawed out, dumping the body somewhere else as a way to throw off medical examiners. But Kuklinski rushed the method, and that was one of the things that led to the authorities becoming very suspicious of him. But one of the things, though, that I think we should also be discussing with Richard Kuklinski is where was all of this going? How many people did he murder? I mean, what was the extent of his crimes? And no, we simply do not have those precise details. It's simply been lost to history. I mean, Richard Kuklinski passed away at the age of 70 from Kawasaki's disease, and that affects the blood vessels. I had a classmate growing up that had Kawasaki's disease, and he was out of school and in the hospital for a solid month. It sounds rather painful. I mean, or just that it's just a very agonizing process. But when Richard Kuklinski was caught, he was sentenced to 2 life sentences, but given the possibility of parole. Granted, they said that he would have been given the possibility of parole after the age of 111, but even that I thought was ridiculous. It's like, why would you ever do that when you don't know how many people this person murdered? Very open about murdering people, but I mean, I just thought that that was an absolutely inappropriate sentencing. Of course, he didn't live to 111, though. It's more of a detail rather than anything. It's more of a statement rather than something else. But when you want to look at somebody who is going through all of these different methods, I mean, it really just comes down to the fact that Kuklinski was not a sexually based serial killer. And the sexually based serial killer needs to have the method that he can use, that he can do over and over again, because he needs to satiate that desire. With Kuklinski, there's definitely more cold, methodical, and calculating behavior. Did he enjoy it? Absolutely. But it's not like that sexual urge, of somebody who just needs to replicate this every so often, like that's like that type of unhealthy urge. In fact, it's just it's something a little bit different. But I think there's quite a difference between being a sexually motivated serial killer and being a sadist. And that's the big category that we would have to put Kuklinski in. He was a sadist. When it comes to the sexually based killers, it's like they have usually one method, and if they deviate from their method, then that just raises an entire basket of questions in itself. Like, what was really going on? Was it really them? Whereas with Kuklinski, he did many different things to see if they worked. And with Kuklinski, though, I also noticed some other things. It's like, how much of this was just being born at the wrong time? He was a very large, intimidating figure, 6'4", 270 pounds. They needed a tough guy. They needed someone who had the type of danger in him, someone with that dangerous personality. And what do we really make of that? I mean, someone who had been through that type of abuse that we described growing up, and someone who also wanted to recreate destruction onto other people. This is exactly what Dr. Julie Armstrong talked about when she was describing serial killers. They were abused as children, so then they want to abuse somebody else. They felt fear when they were children, so they wanted to put the fear into somebody else. They felt helpless as children, so they wanted other people to helpless because that's what they experienced growing up. Recreating the cycles of destructive behaviors. And no, I don't think Richard Kuklinski was an exception to anything that was traditional with serial killers. The only real exception, other than that one exception that we said, that he wasn't sexually motivated for his crimes. But a big question that has risen to people is, how arrogant was Richard Kuklinski? Because when he's talking to the informant known as Dom, who led to his arrest, he's being very open, being very casual, describing how he murdered people and dumped their bodies. I mean, they're just he was either someone who was extremely arrogant, very careless, or he planned on murdering Dom, the informant, and just didn't get a chance to. There was a documentary that came out a couple years ago. I believe it was called Jimmy 9 Lives. And the famous line from that one is, "Killing a person is easy. It's what you do with the body." And this is one of the larger takeaways that I took away, that I had from, going through some of these Richard Kuklinski materials. He didn't seem to care about that. I think that that is also something that really stood out, that, he would dump bodies anywhere, including the industrial freezer, which of course was how he got the name the Iceman. But that really stood out to me, that he would dump bodies in all sorts of places, whereas the thing with Jimmy 9 Lives, if I am remembering the title of that one, that was more about, it's so difficult to get rid of the body, or otherwise you're going to get caught. And they actually say that if you're to somehow pull up a chunk of the sidewalk in New York City, you would find just corpses buried underneath the concrete. Because that was one of the things that the mafia did, the mob and the hitmen would do. They would put the bodies down under cement that would be laid and concrete that would be laid, and once it hardened, no one would ever find the bodies. But that's a big difference, though, with somebody like Kuklinski. He didn't really seem to care where the bodies were dumped. I mean, maybe it's also just someone who has developed sort of a sense of awareness that he's going to dump the bodies and they aren't going to be caught. But I think that this is a case that fascinates a lot of people because Kuklinski did multiple interviews. HBO did multiple things about him. And I think the questions are not so much about the psychology of this individual. I don't really think that that's what's fascinating to people. I think people are pulled into Richard Kuklinski because they're like, we want to know, what is it like in this criminal underworld? They're using him as a window into a darker side of humanity. And yes, absolutely, I would say that Richard Kuklinski was the darker side of humanity, but they're like, how does this way of life operate? As I said, it's highly possible that these things are still happening to this day. Almost certainly they're still happening in that part of the country, New York and New Jersey, as well as all over the country, just in different ways. I said New York and New Jersey because some of the connections that Kuklinski would have had are probably still in place. He only passed away in 2006, so like less than 2 decades ago at the time of this recording. But I do have to remember, though, growing up, that Goof Troop, with Goofy and Pete and Max, Goof Troop did a parody of Richard Kuklinski as the Iceman, where Goofy is the Iceman, and they need somebody to be a paid assassin, but so they hire Goofy as the Iceman, and he just says, Iceman, cubed or crushed. And I was like, this show is dark for a cartoon. But anyway, I digress from that. I would be quite curious, though. What would be your response to our challenge question that we sort of said at the beginning, that thing that was posted on Facebook? It was a meme that I saw, but if you could have a 15-minute conversation with any serial killer, living or dead, who would you choose? I think Kuklinski would be a great choice, and after going through some of the material about him now, yes, I think he would be fascinating. I told you I said Charles Ng for some reasons that we covered in our episode of the Boneyard Killers. But what would you say about that? Like, who would be the serial killer that you would want to talk to? And we can even extend this. If they're from somewhere outside of the English-speaking world, no language barriers, who would you say? And one of the things I would also like to say is we've mentioned the Serial Killer podcast on this channel many times. I mean, we do some type of kind of intercross discussions about it. The very first one that I did was on Michael Ross, the Eggman. I learned about it from the Serial Killer podcast, once again hosted by Thomas Viborg Thune. And I'm going to include a link to that. It's done in the sort of more old-fashioned podcast format that we had here on this channel. But if you like this upload, I highly recommend you check out our upload on Michael Bruce Ross, known as the Eggman or the Roadside Strangler. A link will be posted here. But what I would like to say is just that, well, first and foremost, if you do listen to that one, hopefully you'll make it through the jittery introduction. But that is another one where you get to just look at some aspects of how people function in interviews. Because with Michael Ross, I really didn't like that he was almost just enjoying the moment, enjoying the spotlight. Whereas Richard Kuklinski, absolutely not. I didn't really feel like he was just, I'm showboating about how much fun I had killing people. I thought, at first, as I said, I thought that he was rather cold, but then, he's like, all right, I'm telling my story. Okay, these things happened, and he's actually sharing some real emotion. When I was doing the Michael Ross uploads, it just frustrated me how much he was celebrating the fact that he was a serial killer in the interviews that he did. But once again, so we did a 2-part series on Michael Ross. I highly recommend you check that out. And in comparison to Richard Kuklinski, I find that it's quite different. And what is your answer to our challenge question that we've stated here? I would love to hear from you. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, please drop a comment below. And until next time.